r/nosleep. Hosted by you/Elias_Withero. I'm burning out. I kept my hand on the wheel as I lit my cigarette, the warm evening air filtering through the open windows without a care in the world. The sun sat like a slice of burnt lemon, dripping sour yellow across an orange backdrop. The city rolled past, a humid rise of steel gravestones that reflected the rotting day with unwavering devotion. I downshifted, keeping my smoke locked between my lips, and slowed to a stop at a red light. People bustled across the street before me, chatting urgently on phones pressed against their faces like growths. I watched them feeling slightly bored, mostly restless. I looked to my right at the car idling adjacent to me. A man in a navy business suit tapped manicured fingernails against the leather steering wheel. His windows were up, protecting him from the heat, the noise, and above all, the poverty that surrounded him. He glanced over at me and quickly averted his gaze. I didn't blame him. I was an alien in his elevated world, a string of color with a shade he couldn't possibly understand. My beat-up Honda grumbled pathetically, the loose heat shield loudly smacking the undercarriage as the engine moaned. The light turned green and we parted ways, never to see one another again. That was okay. I'm sure he had his own problems to get back to. I licked smoke from my lips and shifted, content to cruise lazily down the open guts of the city. The organs pulsed and bled around me, the veins of existence winding down another busy workday. Trash blew in billows from the sidewalks, only noticed by the dozens of homeless that pocked the alleys. The heat made me want a drink, but I didn't think that was a good idea right now. Someone honked behind me, but I couldn't be bothered. They passed from the opposite lane, middle finger blaring in my direction. I rolled down the road, the heat shield unrelenting below my seat, the constant clacking starting to get on my nerves. I passed street vendors and storefronts, parked cars and kids playing on the sidewalk dressed in clothes 3 sizes too big for them. A soccer ball bounced out in front of me and I ran it over, feeling a little guilty, but I hadn't had time to react. I checked the rear view and saw drooped shoulders and lost looks. I threw my cigarette out the open window, a billow of cloud now making its way across the melting horizon. It was fat and gray and I had the passing thought that if you cut open a serial killer their insides would be that color. I hoped it wouldn't rain, forcing me to roll up my windows. I needed the heat right now, the suffocating warmth that clogged my throat like a wet sock. I dragged a hand across the back of my neck. It felt like someone had spit on it. I cruised around for another 30 minutes without a destination in mind. At one point I turned on the radio, but started to feel sick so I shut it off. My mouth was dry from the cigarette and I scraped my tongue across my teeth. I lit another smoke and wondered where I was going. Cars honked frantically from all sides, everyone in a mad rush to get home and start the epilogue of their mundane day. I passed them, stared at them inside their cars, and saw purpose and goals that just confused me. An hour later and the day decayed fully into dusk. An unenthusiastic sliver of moon peeked out of the sky, an infected thing that got lost in the unrelenting heat. I was deep downtown now, the crevasses of the city filled with vampires of the night, all rising to get things underway. They didn't even seem to notice the moon. I came to a halt at another light as my phone buzzed in my pocket. Yeah? Hey Jay, what are you up to? My eyes traced a pair of young girls walking a dog, its fur matted and filthy. Hey Myra. Nothing much. Just driving around. You coming over tonight? The girls went into a convenience store and left the dog outside. What's that? I asked, distracted. You want to come over? Now? Whenever. I'm home for the night. Long day, I'm beat. A group of teenage boys wearing backward hats approached the dog. I'll swing by later. You want me to order you some food or something? No, I'll be fine. Myra paused. Everything okay? The boys with the hats began throwing rocks at the dog. Everything's fine, I said as the light turned green and I drove away. Okay, see you soon. Yeah. I love you. Hum. I pulled out another cigarette and stuffed it between my dry lips. Full dark was soon upon me, pushed back only by sodium light and flickering neon billboards. The noise of the night filled the streets, a gaggle of desperate people just trying to make it to sunrise. I watched them, breathed in the dark air, and got a little depressed. Keeping one hand on the wheel, I leaned over to the glove box to see if I had any pills. After a couple seconds of fruitless digging and a chorus of horns, I gave up. I slumped lower in my seat and drove a little faster, hoping maybe I'd get some adrenaline dumped into my system. My stomach grumbled and I wished I had told Myra to order me something. Instead, I pulled into a McDonald's 3 blocks down and waited at the drive-thru. Ahead of me a monstrous man leaned out his window and yelled into the speaker box. A wild beard hung from his chin like a nest of filth, and I turned away, trying to block out his voice. I placed my order and rolled up to the window. Inside, I could see two women at the counter. They were screaming at each other, rolls of fat jiggling and expressions of rage. One of the women held what could only be described as a carton of fries and was waving them furiously in front of her combatant. I tried not to listen to what they were arguing about because I was already feeling a little out of it. A greasy bag was stuffed into my outstretched hand and I drove away. I circled the downtown area as I reached into the soggy paper sack to retrieve my burger. After a couple bites, I became overwhelmed with a sense of despair so strong I thought I would throw up. I tossed the burger out the window and wiped my eyes. I grabbed my cigs and saw I was on my last one. In that moment, the realization was almost too much to bear. I ran a hand across my lips, freeing them from dripping grease. I saved my smoke and just let my arm drop out the window. I needed to talk to someone. I needed a distraction. I thought about going to Myra's place, but couldn't bring myself to just yet. Instead, I cut hard into the low-hanging city and began to crawl through the underbelly. Steam wafted out from grates in the road like the land itself had given up. Somewhere in the distance I heard a gunshot and the ominous toll of police sirens. 10 minutes later, I slowed and slid my car up along the side of the street. A wall of prostitutes lined a brick wall like they were auditioning. Most paid me no attention, a fact I couldn't fault them for. The rattle of the heat shield killed the prophecy of a big payout. I scanned them all without feeling and saw the one I had been looking for. She was older and wearing a hot pink tube top that cut into her soft body like a rubber band around raw meat. Her nylons had holes in them and her black leather heels were scuffed. Fire red lipstick painted her mouth beneath burnt out eyes that rose to greet me. She slowly walked over, recognition flickering across her face like a spark in a long dead stove. She leaned into the car, her yellow teeth revealed beneath a smile that held no cheer. "Hey Jay. Hey. You need some company?" Something like that. "You got money?" I rolled my eyes. "Jesus, Mom, just get in the car will you?" My mother grunted and complied, landing with a thump in the passenger's seat. As she did so, I was assaulted by the smell of cheap perfume and sweat. I pulled away and began to drive once again. "You're cutting into my business hours," my mom said, tapping a purple nail against her exposed thigh. "I just needed to talk to someone," I said, banging a left and swerving to avoid a couple arguing in the street, veins pulsing from angry throats. Mom snorted, "So what are you bothering me for?" I shook my head, "I don't know." She turned to look at me, "You don't look so good, you know." "I don't think I feel well." "What's the matter?" I said nothing and caught a glimpse of the moon, pregnant with stagnant light. "You still seeing that girl?" Mom asked, twirling a finger. "Mara? Mary? What's her name again?" "Myra." "Myra, right. You two have a fight or something?" "No, things are good." "So why are you so mopey?" I looked out the window. "I think something's wrong with me." Mom waved a hand dismissively. "Aw, ain't nothing wrong with you, kid." She reached down and pulled out a plastic baggie that had been stuffed inside her shoe. She tossed it to me. "Here, you're welcome." The baggie landed on my lap. "What are those?" "They'll make you feel better. Don't let anyone ever tell you I was a bad mommy." "Thanks." She looked long and hard at me, then, a slow smile creeping up her face. I think I know what's going on." "Do you now?" She reached over and squeezed my cock through my pants. "That little girlfriend of yours isn't giving you the attention you need." Annoyed, I swatted her hand away. "That's not the issue." Mom retreated to her side of the car. "Well then, I don't know what your problem is and I don't think I can help you." We passed a group of 4 people carrying baseball bats, pants sagged low, gold chains catching the headlights. For a moment, I wished they would attack me, beat me to death right then and there. "Let me drop you off," I said distantly. "Yeah, I need to get back." "Good talk though." When I dropped her back on her corner, I pressed a couple 20s into her hand. She looked down at them with mild surprise. "Take care of yourself, Ma." "You too, Jay." And then she was swallowed back up by the night and I was lost in the streets again. I looked down at the pills she had given me and decided to take them. I popped them in my mouth and waited. I passed a car getting towed and the owner was screaming at the mechanic, his face puffy and red and not at all human. By the time I reached Myra's, the drugs had kicked in. They smoothed out the edges and dropped me below the surface, mellowing me out just enough to stave off a panic attack. I smoked my last cigarette in the parking lot, staring up at the apartment complex. I climbed to the 3rd floor, feeling like my feet were too heavy and fumbled with the key at Myra's door. I pushed inside and a thick heat wrapped itself around my already damp skin. The lights were off and the apartment was dark except for the glow of the TV. Myra was curled up on the couch, her eyes glazed over. She sat up when I entered and smiled. "Took you long enough," she said, standing and giving me a hug. I wrapped my arms around her because I didn't know what else to do. She led me over to the couch and pulled me down next to her. She retrieved a paper bag from the floor. "I got you a burrito. Just in case." Her small act of kindness almost brought me to tears and I hugged her so tightly I thought I would disappear. We watched TV and I stuffed the burrito down my throat. When I was finished, I felt bloated and sleepy. I dragged myself over to the fridge and got myself a beer. I drained it in a couple pulls and then went back to Myra. She looked hard at me and I knew she wanted to fuck, but the apartment was so hot I wasn't really feeling it. When she slid her hand down my pants and gripped my dick, I decided to give it a shot anyway. We went into the bedroom and undressed quickly, my shirt sticking to my back. I climbed onto the bed, onto Myra, her scent consuming me. We made out for a little while and I felt her hands claw up my back. I played with her tits and then I tried to shove myself inside her, but I was still soft. I flipped her over and ate her ass and ran my fingers through her pubic hair, hoping that'd do something. Myra pulled me down next to her and reached for my still soft cock. She stuffed it down her throat, which did a little, but not much. Finally, she crawled up the length of my body and whispered hotly into my ear, "You can do it if you want. You know, I don't mind. I want you to fuck me hard tonight." Taking the cue, I gripped her by the throat and slapped her hard across the face. She whimpered and rolled onto her back. I sat up on her and felt myself stir to life as her cheek glowed red in the yellow light that snuck in from the bedroom window. I pinched her nipples and she squirmed below me. I slapped her again and then punched her in the stomach. The air rushed out of her lungs like a quivering balloon. Fully erect, I rammed my dick into her and fucked her raw, one hand clawed around her chin, fingers gripping the inside of her mouth. Her teeth bit into me and I leaned down and bit her shoulder, hard enough to draw blood. I came and rolled off her, sitting up on the edge of the bed with my face in my hands. Myra took a moment to collect herself and then wrapped her arms around my shoulders. Her voice was gentle. "It's okay, Jay. You don't have to feel bad. Do you have any cigarettes?" I asked, almost blinded by the light from the window. She rolled away from me and opened the nightstand. She handed me a battered pack and a lighter. I kissed her before taking them. When I lit up, I offered it to her first, but she shook her head with a coy little smile. It was a game we played when things were good between us. She pulled me back against her and rested her cheek against my bare chest while I smoked and stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of person I was. She fell asleep after a while and I just lay there sweating until I was too exhausted to give a fuck anymore. I spent the next day with Myra, mostly walking around the city because her apartment was too hot. She muttered something about getting a window unit, but I was hungry and didn't really pay much attention. We got breakfast at a diner, overcooked eggs and watered down coffee, and then went shopping. The mall downtown was pretty dirty and we drifted through the masses looking at stuff we couldn't afford. I bought her a smoothie and felt a little better about last night. Eventually, we found ourselves at the movie theater and she asked if we could see a film she had been bothering me to see. I kissed her, told her we could, and spent the next 2 hours elbow to elbow with a stranger who talked through the whole thing. I didn't pay attention to what was happening on screen and halfway through I needed to piss. I got up and strolled to the bathroom, feeling bored and wishing I hadn't eaten the eggs earlier. When I got back to my seat, Myra could tell I was restless and so I threw my arm around her and that seemed to help. When the movie was over, we decided to sneak into another one. She let me choose and so I picked something without really looking. I felt kind of bad that we hadn't paid and so I bought Myra popcorn and a Coke and my conscience decided that was good enough. After the second movie, we went back to her place and put on some music while she made dinner. I lounged on the couch and scanned my phone, not really sure what I was looking for. Dinner came and went, we opened a bottle of wine and got a little drunk. Myra was giggly and I asked if she had any more alcohol. I downed a few beers and felt a little better, like I was at her level now, and we curled up on the couch after opening the windows. We watched some TV and ended up having sex again. I didn't hit her and managed to get it up enough to come inside her. We talked for a little bit afterwards and then she fell asleep on the bed. I wasn't really tired yet and so I got a cigarette from the nightstand and went back out into the living room where I smoked in the darkness, not thinking about anything. I chucked the burnt filter into the trash, drank another beer, and then looked out the window into the night. The vampires were out and about, prowling the streets and slinking across the shadows. Cars patrolled the grid and I wondered where everyone was going. A child was crying in the apartment above me and I sat down against the wall and listened for a little bit. Restless, hot, and mildly depressed, I went back into the bedroom and crawled next to Myra. She stirred and placed a hand across my chest. I looked at her, watched her, and wished I could love her the way she loved me. The next morning Myra asked if I wanted to go to the beach. I felt sleep deprived and kinda claustrophobic, so I told her no and left. She pouted a little, but I promised I'd call her later in the day. I made up something about work, but it was Sunday and she knew I didn't have to go anywhere. I ended up driving around for most of the day, hoping I'd stumble across something to think about, but didn't have much luck. I stopped and got a couple packs of cigarettes and smoked probably too many. At around 4, I went to a bar and had a drink, but felt shitty cause I was the only person there and so I left. I was restless and wished something would happen to pull my attention for a couple hours. I went to the beach alone and felt guilty, so I didn't really enjoy myself very much. I sat in my car with the windows rolled down, smoking and watching the sun plummet from the sky. A couple surfers were still out, catching the last of the waves, and I watched them through the glare in my windshield. I got jealous after a little bit and drove away. I remembered the drugs my mother had given me and checked to see how many I had left. I was bummed when I discovered they were gone. With nothing better to do, I drove back downtown and looked for Mom. By the time I reached the spot I knew she worked, the clock informed me it was already 10. I slid up to the curb and scanned the scattered prostitutes. I didn't see her. One of them noticed me though and came over. I recognized her from previous visits and rolled down my window. She leaned against my car, her face all dark lines and old makeup. "Hey Jay." "Hi. What are you doing here?" "Looking for my mom." "You seen her?" She looked away and seemed kinda sick. "Ah, shit." "What?" "Your mom was killed last night, Jay." I lit a cigarette and said nothing for a couple minutes. "No one called you?" I shook my head and exhaled a gale of smoke. The prostitute sighed and looked at me with droopy eyes. "Damn, I'm sorry kid. I liked your mom a lot." "What happened?" I finally said, biting my lip a little. "Someone found her early this morning in the old warehouse district. Her head was all smashed in." I felt my stomach turn and wished I had something to drink. "That's really sad," I said after a little bit. "I don't know why someone would want to do that to your mom. She was sweet. I liked her." "Do you know who did it?" I asked, knowing I should be feeling something I wasn't. The woman nodded. "I seen the one who took her. He used to take me all the time, but said my pussy stank. Rude motherfucker." "Who was it?" I droned. She waved a hand. "Some lawyer bastard. He took me to his house a couple times and asked me to shit on him while he jerked off. We didn't really have room in his car for that kind of thing, you know?" "Sure. Do you want to know where he lives?" I blinked. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I nodded and she told me. "Has he been arrested?" I asked stupidly. The woman snorted. "Honey, no one cares about us girls down here. Hell, most our clients are cops and they're the worst of the bunch. They never pay and are always the roughest. No one's going to give a shit your mom is dead." I thought that was a little insensitive and wished she hadn't said anything, but kept my mouth shut. I didn't really know what else to say and wondered if I was having a traumatic experience. I waited for my heart to start racing, but it just couldn't be bothered. "You have any pills?" I finally asked. The woman looked sadly at me and I looked out the window across the street and waited for her to answer. I felt a hand nudge my arm and I turned and took the little capsule she extended toward me. "You okay, Jay?" she asked after a second. I shrugged. "I don't know, my mom was murdered, you know?" She nodded understandingly. "You want a quick fuck? Something to make you feel better?" I hoisted the drugs. "This should be enough, I think." "Thanks, by the way." "You take care of yourself," she offered. "Sure. Yeah." I drove away and threw the pills back and waited to feel sad. I ended up back at the beach, right as the drugs kicked in. I went and sat in the sand, pretty glazed over, and listened to the waves. At some point I started to cry and tried to stop before someone saw me. I opened my phone and saw I had a text from Myra. I remembered I had promised to call her. I put my phone away and wiped my eyes and wished things were a little better than they were. At around 1, the tide began to lap at my shoes and so I got up and went back to my car. Myra had tried calling me at some point but I had been too out of it to notice. I kept thinking about how my mother had died. It upset me knowing no one would do anything about. She was still a person. She had still been important to me. I thought about how no one cared and started feeling sorry for myself. I put my forehead against the steering wheel and cried a little more and wished I could have seen her one more time. I ended up falling asleep and when I woke up I felt sick. I smoked a cigarette as the sun rose and pulled my sweaty collar off my neck. I decided I wasn't going to go to work that day. I didn't think I could have handled it, and so I began to drive once more. I realized at some point my mother was still dead. I thought about what the prostitute had told me. Her head had been bashed in. That made me feel even more sick, and I knew I should stop smoking, but lit another instead. Where had she said the guy lived again? After some pondering, I dug out the recent information from the addled mess that was my mind and pointed my car in that direction. It took about 30 minutes to get to the lawyer's house, and I parked across the street from it. He lived in a big house on the outskirts of the city where people like me had no business going. I kept the windows up and smoked and waited for something to happen. I didn't know what I was doing, but I stayed put because I didn't have anywhere else to be. After about 20 minutes, him came outside. 2 kids trailed him, maybe 6 or 7 years old, a boy and a girl. It looked like he was taking them to school. When he pulled his car out of the garage, I squinted and felt something flutter in my chest. It was the guy I had seen in traffic the other day, the one with the manicured nails that tapped against the steering wheel. I was sort of surprised I recognized him, and it made me feel gross and angry and confused. Where were the cops dragging him off to jail? I closed my eyes at the thought and pressed my fingers against them, fighting a headache. The whole scene wasn't right. It was far too mundane, inexplicably relaxed and unfazed. I ducked down low as he backed out of his driveway. I followed him at a distance and watched as he dropped his kids off at school. Then I tailed him to a coffee shop and chewed on my lip as he went inside. When he came back out, he was on his phone and he was laughing. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles cracked, and I decided I needed to chill out. I followed him into the city and saw where he worked and made a mental note. The way he casually got out of his car and threw his coffee cup away into a nearby trash can almost sent me into hysterics, but I managed to keep my blood pressure down to a dull roar. I felt my head fragmenting into chaotic pieces that drifted into the heat of the day and soared high into the paper-thin sky. Sweat ran down the back of my neck and I swatted at it, feeling disoriented. My mind balled up into frayed knots and I tugged at each end, trying to make sense of it all. Finally, I sped off and went to a hardware store. I bought a hammer and threw it into the passenger's seat. I needed to take a breath, but didn't really want anything that would cement me right now. I was feeling hurt and reckless and pretty fucking angry about a lot of things. Myra called me again and I almost threw my phone out the window. I sped around the city, honking at anyone who got in my way, and realized I was losing it. At noon, I went and parked my car outside the school. I waited for hours, smoking until my mouth had holes in it. Thick beads of sweat ran down into my eyes and I scrubbed at my face furiously. The world was a dizzy, sweltering mess, a blur of dried out color that ran together and swathed the buildings in blinding light. I watched the school, waiting. When the kids eventually emptied out of the building, I got out and waited to recognize the 2 I had seen earlier. I spotted them and approached, feeling pretty exposed. As I walked, I could smell my own body odor wafting from open pores. I spotted the children and waved them over. They approached after some coaxing and eyed me cautiously. I told them their dad had sent me to come pick them up. They weren't convinced and I saw a few teachers notice me. I knew I needed a shower, that it looked pretty bad, and I felt a clock counting down in the back of my head. I urged the kids to come with me, that their father was waiting for them and wanted to take them out for pizza. I took a chance and told them he was going to be pretty pissed if they didn't come, and that seemed to do the trick. They looked at one another with such a familiar expression of fear I almost left right then and there. But then I thought about my dead mom and the 3 of us were hoofing it back to my car. Once they had climbed in, I knew I was good. Whatever came after, I would deal with it. I just needed an hour and maybe I could balance things out a little bit. I drove fast and the kids asked a lot of questions from the backseat that I ignored. I could tell they were getting scared and that something wasn't right. The girl started crying and the boy put his arm around her and told her to stop, but his voice shook and he didn't seem convinced. I took them down to the old warehouse district and smashed their heads in with a hammer. I did it one at a time, in the seclusion of an empty parking lot. The boy went first, crying and sputtering and pissing himself. I bent him over the hood of my car with one hand around his neck, and beat his skull in. It was a little harder than I thought it'd be, and the force with which I had to swing the hammer surprised me in a gross kind of way. I tossed his body to the ground and wiped blood from my hands and did the girl next. She screamed so loud I thought someone would come and save her, but no one did. Because she was squirming around so much, the first blow hit her jaw and a lot of her teeth came out and clattered over the hood of the car. They looked really small and I almost didn't hit her again, but the moment passed and I brought the hammer back down and she died as her skull caved in. I tossed her next to her brother and then sat up on the hood of the car and smoked. My fingers were bloody and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably, and it took a long time to get my lighter to work. I stared at the mutilated little bodies and my mom was still dead. Something squirmed in my stomach and crawled up my throat and I tried to ignore it. Something was seeping through my pants and I realized it was blood. I let it coat me and just looked at the dead kids, feeling a panic attack start to unravel inside me. I wasn't going to get away with this. Teachers had seen me. People would recognize me. The bodies would be found. And my mom was still dead. I covered my face with my hands and felt like I would cry, but I couldn't seem to jumpstart the process. The sun bleached my skin with sickly warmth and I struggled to escape it. I got off the car and prodded one of the corpses, half wishing it'd get up and give me a hug and tell me everything would be okay. With a kind of horrible finality, I realized that my life was over. I couldn't run away from this, and once I started to accept that, the heaviness in my chest burned away a little. I left the hammer where it was and got into my car. I figured I probably had a day before the manhunt started. I wasn't clever enough to cover this up and a part of me didn't even want to. I felt bad for the kids, but I needed to know, no matter what happened to me, that the man who killed my mother was out there hurting. I started the Honda and peeled away from the scene. The sun was setting and I put it in my rearview mirror. I decided I was just going to drive until someone stopped me. I rolled down the windows and stuck my arm out, letting the wind dry the blood on my skin. I didn't know how far I would get and didn't really care. These last few hours of freedom were none but my own, and that made me feel not quite so lost. I hit the highway and really got the engine going. I pulled out my phone and called Myra and told her I loved her, that she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Before she could respond, I broke up with her, told her she needed to move on and find someone who could give her the life she deserved and that I wasn't that guy. I hung up when she started to cry, knowing right then that my heart couldn't handle that. I tossed my phone out the window and lit a cigarette and exhaled all the hell I had to spare. 2 hours later and I had made it out into the countryside, long grass reflecting orange waves of melting sunlight. I emptied my mind and just drove, waiting for the road to end. The heat shield clacked loudly beneath me and I knew I would soon be burned out of existence.